Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, all right, this is hot. All right, good. Welcome to the Business Services Performance and ETPL session. I hope y'all are in the right place. My name is Stephen Wilson. I'm the Data and Information Director at the Office of Workforce Development with the Technical College System in Georgia, which is a lot of words to say that I'm just handle performance and reporting for Title I WIOA. This is Jason Mann. He is our ETPL specialist. And so Jamie asked us to come in and talk to you guys kind of about business services and how that interacts with performance and the eligible training provider list. I looked at the agenda. How many of y'all were in David Dietrich's session yesterday? Most of y'all don't need an overview of business services. And how many of y'all actually do business services day in, day out? All right, so that's the other half. So I don't need to go over too deeply about what business services are, but just know that I'm going to be talking about performance as it relates to OJT, customized training, registered apprenticeships, and incumbent worker training. So I'll give you a little review on performance, and then we'll get into the cross-section of performance with business service activities. So these first three performance measures will pretty much apply to everybody who is WIOA funded. So if they go through the WIOA program, they're going to count for these first three measures: the entered employment rate in the second quarter after exit, the entered employment rate in the fourth quarter after exit, and the median earnings rate. So what the second Q2 entered employment rate is basically after the person exits, we're going to look and see if they have a job where they're earning at least $1 in unsubsidized wages. So that means that the employer isn't getting reimbursed for those wages. It is completely on the employer to pay at least $1 in that second quarter after exit. So that month 4 to 6 after they exit WIOA, we're going to be looking to see if they have a job. All right, and if they do, then they will count as a positive for this measure. It's kind of the whole point of WIOA is to get a job, so the feds want to make sure that we're getting folks jobs. And very similar is the fourth quarter entered employment rate. So we're going to be looking in the fourth quarter after the person exits, which will be the 10th to the 12th month after they leave the program. And if they have $1 of unsubsidized wages, then they will count as a positive. But we'd like for our participants to earn a little more than $1, so feds they grade us on median earnings. So what they're going to do is look at all the people who counted as a positive in that second quarter. They're going to sort those earnings, so from $1 to whatever, $1 million, hopefully. And they're going to pick the number in the middle, and that'll be the median earnings rate for that cohort. Any questions on that? Because it used to be average, and there was a little confusion on average versus median, but just think it's the one in the middle now. Okay, so those are all pretty straightforward, and those with a couple asterisks, and then we'll get into those later. But for the most part, everybody's going to count for these three measures: Q2 unemployment rate, Q4 unemployment rate, and median earnings. Okay. Now the credential attainment rate is a little different. It's only going to apply to folks who are in education or training, with the exception of those in OJT or customized training. Okay? So if they're in OJT or customized training, you don't have to worry about a credential for these individuals. And we'll get into what counts as a recognized credential in just a second. So examples of a recognized credential: your associate's degrees, your bachelor's degrees, occupational certificates, licenses, occupational certifications, and occupational certificates. Now, when we ask the feds, because this is straight from their guidance, we ask the feds, hey, what's the difference between an occupational certificate and a certification? They never really told us. So we looked through all of their guidance, and I did find one little piece where when they're talking about registered apprenticeships, because all registered apprenticeships, if you complete a registered apprenticeship, you get a certificate of completion. That certificate of completion counts as a recognized credential, and they have us code that in our system as a occupational certificate, which is if y'all are involved, you go down, when you pick what type of credential, it's the occupational certificate. So if your person's completing a registered apprenticeship, use that code. But that's the only designation I found between, that differentiates between occupational certification and the certificate. Pretty regularly we're asked about what doesn't count, or pretty regularly we're asked about OSHA, ServSafe, CPR, those type of credentials. They do not count as recognized credentials according to the federal government. Another example is the old work-ready certificate, or ACT's NCRC. That does not count as a recognized credential for the purposes of WIOA performance. And then we've had some folks ask about mobility training for individuals who need that kind of training, and that does not count either. Typically when we're asked, does this credential count, we first ask the folks to look at the guidance in TEGL 1016. It's pretty spelled out on what does and does not count. All of this information is in that TEGL, as well as a bunch of other information that kind of directs folks on what counts and what doesn't. If you still have questions, of course we're happy to try and make a determination on credentials. The feds and us, I mean, there's so many credentials out there, it's pretty impossible to have a comprehensive list of everything that's going to count. So if you go through the TEGLs and still have questions, ask us and we'll try and make a determination on a case-by-case basis. But typically, if the credential is coming from one of these type of organizations, you know, a technical school, a university, an industry association, some sort of state or federal agency who does licensures, it'll typically count. If you're asking about a credential that doesn't involve one of these agencies, that's probably a red flag. But just because it is a part of one of these agencies doesn't necessarily automatically make it count as a credential. So this is kind of your first, litmus test. If it passes, it's coming from one of these type of entities, then you go to step 2 and kind of ask some more questions about that certification. Okay. So those 4 measures are what we're currently measured on, but beginning with PY20, which starts in a year and a month from now, or I guess a year and 2 weeks from now, there's some additional performance measures that are going to start counting. Now we're currently tracking these numbers, but they're not counting against the state or local areas for performance. But we're just trying to get a baseline number. But the measurable skills gain measure, it's also looking at only individuals who are enrolled in education or training. And it's looking to see if during that program year the individual increases their skill level. Now what counts as a skills gain? So if they take a skills assessment and are able to increase their skill level, 1 grade level, an educational functioning level, then that'll count as a skills gain. If they're in an OJT or customized training service and they meet a benchmark that's established in those contracts, then that'll count as a skills gain. If they're in a registered apprenticeship and they move from 1 year to the next year, that'll count as a positive for skills gains. If they're in an educational program, or if they're a full-time student, and they complete 12 hours in a semester successfully, that'll count as a skills gain. If they're a part-time student and do 12 hours in successive semesters, that'll count as a positive skills gain. Any questions on skills gains? Okay. And then the last the new measures are employer-related. So the feds want to make sure that we're serving our employers well. One of the ways that they're asking us to do that is to see if we're giving employers somebody that they want to keep around. So they're going to look in the second quarter after the person exits, see where they're employed, and then check back in on them in the fourth quarter after they exit and see if they're with that same employer. And if they are, then that's a positive, and then we get a positive outcome for the retention rate. The second employer measure is what we call the repeat business customers. So if an employer receives a service from the workforce system, now that could be a work-based learning activity, that could be a rapid response event, that could be they attended some sort of orientation from Department of Labor's shop. Any kind of service that's provided by the workforce system, If they receive one of those, and then they receive an additional service within a 3-year period, that counts as a repeat business customer. And we're taking the percentage of employers that we serve, and of that number, how many got an additional service, and that'll be our repeat customer rate.
So I'm in Augusta. We have a lot of IT. I have companies that will hire people in at like $13.50 an hour. They work for 6 months, and they're offered $4 or $5 more an hour for a contract position. That counts against the employer that the employee got a better job.
Well, it don't count against the employer, it counts against us, the local areas in the state. But yeah, that would be a negative.
So even though they've bettered themselves, the employee has, it's still a negative.
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
It doesn't, well, it does in the employer's perspective because they no longer have that employee, which is what the feds are measuring us on for this. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't make it up. I'm just following the rules. All right. All right. Any other questions on the employer services? Okay. All right. So how does this interact with business services? So with incumbent worker training, y'all don't have to worry about performance for incumbent workers. As long as they are only eligible as an incumbent worker and y'all don't give them additional services funded through adult dislocated worker funds, normal formula funds, they don't count for performance. Now we still ask that, or the feds require that us to track these individuals so that you're not just running off with money, and they're kind of interested in, do they still have a job, and did they get a credential if that was the case, that sort of thing. But those numbers aren't, they don't count against us. So we don't have to worry about the performance measures for incumbent worker training. Any questions on that? And does everybody, I know we've got some locals, does everybody know that incumbent workers are their own category in our case management system and that they need to be tracked separately? They've got their own application process and everything. Okay, all right. So customized training, you don't have to worry about credentials, as we mentioned earlier. And then but they do count for the other measures. So for employment, the good news is, as part of the contract, generally the employer's going to hire this person or keep them on after the training. So the employment measures are pretty much taken care of. And then that skills gain measure, again, in that contract for the customized training, there should be benchmarks set in place as a part of that contract. So as long as the individual meets those benchmarks that are established, that skills gain measure is taken care of as well. So customized training, if you can get employers engaged with it, is really strong for performance. OJT is pretty similar in that you don't have to worry about the credential rate. But you do have to worry about the other measures, employment and earnings. Skills gain, again, with the contract, there should be benchmarks in that OJT contract. Now the question is for an example of a benchmark in an OJT contract. And it really depends on the employer, but essentially if they're able to perform the roles and responsibilities of that, the occupation that they're being trained in and can show competency. Again, I'm not a business service person. I've seen a couple of contracts, but I mean, y'all probably know what do y'all put in contracts? Let me turn it around. What do you put in a contract to kind of show that the person has been successful?
The skills outline just lists the skills they're supposed to be trained in during their OJT, and it's graded before they start and then again post-training.
All right, well.
So would that count? Maybe?
It sounds like, I mean, I think that's the general idea, if they're able to demonstrate that they've met the skills outlined in the contract.
Okay. Thank you.
We also do a midpoint evaluation. That way we can see if we need to adjust the training plan, if we need to, increase the time, or if they're, ahead of schedule, we can decrease the time as well. That way we can do a modification.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that sounds like exactly what we're after in terms of skills gain. So, and then for registered apprenticeships, every measure does apply to the registered apprenticeship. The good news in that With the credential rate, like I said earlier, if they complete a registered apprenticeship and they get that certificate of completion, the feds consider that a recognized credential. Where that kind of gets, you gotta weigh your options. So the feds also consider registered apprenticeships as employment, but that's not measured until the second quarter after you exit the program. So you kind of have to decide, if we want to get that credential from the end of their apprenticeship, do we hold on to them and hope that they still have a job, after they exit the program, or do we want to count them as a positive for employment, exit them while they're still in the apprenticeship, and then maybe they have another credential during the course of their apprenticeship, like a midpoint type of credential that you can count, exit them, and then if they're still in the apprenticeship, they'll count as a positive. So it's kind of have to weigh your options there. But then, and for the measurable skills gain rate, like I said earlier, moving from 1 year in an apprenticeship to the next year of an apprenticeship will count as a positive for that measure.
We're really trying to figure out how to do an entrepreneurship education program, but the problem that we're running into is finding an industry credentialing body for entrepreneurship education. And so I was looking at that and wondering, entrepreneurship is essentially a lot of on-the-job training. Is there a pathway within that would potentially work?
It depends on how you structure it. Were you in David's thing?
I was not,
You should've.
regretfully.
Yeah, if you structure it properly, I don't see why not, because half of entrepreneurship would be, you're literally on the job because you're making that job. But it would probably get hazy. You have to ask a lawyer on that one. But yeah, you wouldn't have to worry about the credential if you did an OJT.
You needed a credential. That could be in business management, that credential, because that's, yeah,
Yeah, if it's in a structured course environment, yeah.
yeah, okay.
So like, everything's excluded. So what about the customers who gain a new skill through IWT but transition to another company? How do we?
You don't have to worry about them.
Okay.
No, it's a double-edged sword. You don't have to worry about them, but you're also not getting credit that you can announce to everybody, hey, look how great a job we're doing. You can track those. Like I said, we're tracking those numbers. So if they're put in the system properly, we can present to you, yeah, these people, we have a placement or an employment rate of whatever, but they're income workers, so they're already employed. But maybe earnings, we can say, hey, these folks are earning this, but it's not going to count for us or against us.
So does that mean that we don't have to track them for?
That's not what I just said.
Well, you said that they didn't count for anything.
No, they don't count.
Just wanted clarification.
But you have to put them in the system. They need to be categorized as income worker training.
And then track for a year
individuals
after.
And track thereafter.
Okay. And if they're co-enrolled though, so say we do an orientation
if they're-
service for them as an adult.
Then if they have one service that is formula funded, they're kicked into full-blown WIOA performance.
So that might be an
Well, no, they don't count on the IWT side. They would just be on the adult side.
Hey, Stephen. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Siri. Do we have a way yet to batch load these individuals for if we have large projects and you're going to ask us to load them in and account all their details and then track them? Do we foresee a way that we can do this other than having one case manager have to load 100 participants?
You have 2 case managers. Load 50 participants. Not at this moment. That is definitely something that we are very interested in pursuing. Getting them in wouldn't be as tricky because the form fields and the IWT application's pretty straightforward. But the trick comes in managing them after they're in. You still have that workload because it's on an individual basis. But yeah, I'm actually going to Geo's conference next week, so I'll definitely put a bug in Mike's ear to see where they're at on that.
So, because there isn't any assistance to batch load them in right now, is there any way that we could get assistance from the state level to maybe hire a temporary, say we have an incumbent worker that's gonna be 100 or 200 people in our area, is there any assistance that we could get from a state level that would help us to hire additional people to man that particular project?
That's possible. That is unfortunately not something I can make a ruling on, but I definitely would support that if you were to bring it to those who can make that decision. Okay?
You did say for the IWT, they are excluded for everything, but if we assign them to orientation, they are now looking at performance.
So orientation's a little tricky because it's not a staff-assisted service in terms of, throwing them into participation. So it shouldn't if it's just orientation, but if they are in some other service, if you're co-enrolling them, and you say at the end you put them in, for some reason they don't make it out as in their current job, and you want to put them in a job search or something, then yeah, they would be if they're co-enrolled with staff-assisted services from adult or disability worker funding, then.
But just orientation, no.
If it's just orientation, no. There's a couple other services like the online LMI service. That doesn't count. That is
It's just with most of the participants, they go through orientation. So orientation is normally the first service that assigned.
Right.
And then they'll go into IWT.
Right.
I just wanted to make sure that if we put
that-
them in orientation, that
If
they are
it's the
no
101,
longer excluded.
make sure it's the 101. You're not calling some other code orientation. If it's the 101, then you should be fine.
Okay, thanks.
I see hands moving, but I don't know if there were questions. Is that it? Oh, okay. All right. All right, Jason.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. So again, my name is Jason Mann. I am an ETPL specialist for the TCSG Office of Workforce Development. Today, I will be speaking with you about the ETPL, or the Eligible Training Provider List, sometimes referred to as the Eligible Training Providers and Programs List. That programs is very significant. Before I get started, I want to point out that everyone should have two documents. One is going to be a WIOA desk reference about the ETPL that provides a very broad overview. If you didn't get one, please raise your hand, and I have Julius come around and give you those two documents. Keep your hands raised, please. Thank you. That one is going to be very helpful for the presentation. Much of my presentation is going to mirror what you see on that document, a lot of the same or similar definitions. Today, I'm really just trying to provide a broad overview of the ETPL to kind of assist you with understanding it as far as it pertains to business services. The other document that you will see is going to be a document for the Georgia Non-Public Post-Secondary Education Commission. This is also going to be a very critical document. When I will be covering a piece about IMPEC, as we refer to them, and their role in the whole ETPL process. So you can also use that document as a reference, and they're both great resources for today as well as when you leave. Again, like I said, my main focus today is just to provide a basic overview of the ETPL process so that I can give everyone a general understanding of what it entails. Also today, joining me, I have my peer, Norris Smith, who will be assisting with the microphone. He's also an ETPL specialist for the state office. And then I also have Julius Allen here with me, Provider Services Manager for WorkSource Atlanta Regional Commission. Julius has a wealth of knowledge, so if there are any questions from a local perspective that I may not be able to answer, Julius will be more than happy to assist. So please feel free if you have any questions in that regard. And now, again, as I said, we won't get into the weeds of the ETPL today. I'm really going to kind of briefly go over the process. I'll highlight a few pieces that are critical to the business services, economic development, as far as your role in the process. But beyond that, we're just going to kind of get a general understanding of everything. So to provide some emphasis on the importance of the ETPL, there's two things I first want to point out. And those are two main purposes of WIOA. One being connecting talent with opportunity, and two being aligning with labor market. The ETPL plays a critical role in these two purposes. And if you take a very close look at the presentation right now, you will see that chain between the two purposes that I have listed. And that chain is a very, very important piece. Okay, I guess no one's paying attention because I know the chain isn't up there. So I did that purposely. Just want to see if anybody was paying attention, if anybody raised their hands and like pointed it out to me and said, hey, there's no chain on your presentation. But I also did that because the ETPL is a list. So to our participants, that list is very thin, like a piece of paper, almost invisible. But that ETPL, like I said, is a very critical chain in these two purposes, connecting talent with opportunity and aligning them with labor market. Although the participants don't see everything that we do and everything that's involved with those operations, it is very critical that we do our best to work together and optimize the ETPL and make sure we're maximizing our participants when we connect them to opportunity, and that opportunity is aligned with labor market demand. The ETPL is tasked with a great burden. It's tasked with making sure that these participants are properly prepared with career training that is aligned, like I said, with labor market demand. And everyone in this room, as well as many others around the state, we are all responsible for this. So I really want to emphasize, like I said, just like I have no chain up here and the participant think, for all they know, the ETPL is invisible. All they see is a training list with providers and programs that can help them get occupational training to get a career. But we have a very huge responsibility ensuring that that list is optimized and we have great training providers that can make sure that these participants are prepared when they go out there into the workforce. So I really want to emphasize that piece and knowing that this is a very important part of what we do in workforce development, our ETPL. Okay, so that brings us to our ETP provider requirements. Again, I have a brief definition. You can find this definition on that one page that you have, the desk reference. But the main pieces with this, we want all of our training providers to be established for at least 6 months. This piece is just to make sure that their operations are up to par. We don't want a provider coming into workforce development using our funds to fund the operation. Our funds is for the participants to take advantage of those training programs. So this is just a basic establishment just to ensure that those providers are established and well ran. Most of our requirements, that's what they're aimed to do. Additionally, programs. Any programs that provider has to be available to the public and have a published catalog. Next, ADA compliance and current up-to-date state and federal taxes. ADA compliance kind of speaks for itself. That's something that we should be checking anytime we approve a training provider or go through the process of approval. The up-to-date state and federal taxes, again, is another way just to make sure that the operations are up to par. We don't want a training provider that is behind on taxes. So these requirements, again, are just baseline requirements to ensure that our providers are stable and sustainable. Now, this last piece is very important. Every provider must provide documentation that they are accredited, that they have accreditation, and they're authorized. Now, this is critical because although we have many providers tied to our networks, the Technical College System of Georgia, the great Technical College System of Georgia, as well as the University System of Georgia, for our non-public post-secondary education institutions, these institutions need to be authorized by NPEC, which actually brings us to our next slide, the Georgia Non-Public Post-Secondary Education Commission. Again, I provided you with a document about NPEC. Please review that. It's a great resource, a great reference. As it states, NPEC authorizes and regulates the operations of in-state non-public and out-of-state post-secondary colleges and schools operating or offering instruction in Georgia. As you can see, up here I have the link to NPEC. You can also find that on the document. If you ever want to visit their site, learn more about what they do They also have a great and very comprehensive list of all programs that have been authorized by IMPEC, as well as those that have been closed, those that are no longer authorized, if you ever want to check to ensure that a provider is authorized by IMPEC. Now, another critical piece that we are having to address right now regarding IMPEC, and this is also a requirement of the ETPL, which I would touch on a little bit as we move forward through the presentation, but all programs have to be authorized through IMPEC as well. And this is a key piece that I really want to drive home, because as business services or economic development representatives, you may be dealing with an existing provider that wants to create a new program. That program if this is an institution that has to be IMPEC authorized, that program needs to be authorized through IMPEC as well. And like I said, I want to emphasize this because right now we're going through the process of cleaning up some programs that have been approved for the ETPL because providers were authorized through IMPEC, but that specific program had not been authorized by IMPEC yet. So we have to really do a good job of making sure that we push that agenda and, hey, is the program also authorized by IMPEC? And of course, we manage and administer it at the state, but if we can take care of it at the front lines and be motivated and confident about speaking to this piece when we're talking to the training providers, it helps, because then we can nip it in the bud before parts of the process get initiated. Now, with IMPEC, outside of TCSG and USG, there are exemptions. As you can see in the presentation, if you have a truck driving academy that's authorized or administered by Georgia Public Safety, you have theological schools, barber, cosmetology, those schools are exempt. So there are some exceptions to the rule. But if the program or provider does not fit within that scope, that provider or program does need to be approved by IMPEC. Additionally, they are also a great resource if you're looking at out-of-state colleges. They work within the SARA system, the State Authorization Reciprocity System, which works with other states to track other authorized institutions from out of state. So when we have out-of-state providers that are interested in joining the Georgia ETPL, you can refer to this resource as a great way to check to make sure that they're authorized. I know I provided quite a bit already. Do we have any questions so far?
So in Augusta, we have Clubhouse Coding Boot Camp, which is run through Augusta Tech with a partner agency, the Clubhouse. That program is on the non-credit side of Augusta Tech. So are you saying that that program needs to be on this list as well?
Augusta Tech is providing the educational portion, like training.
They subcontract out the educational portion with a partner agency who's the Clubhouse. They are the providers. They created the content. Their teacher is on site for, I think it's 360 hours,
Okay.
contact hours. But it's not, it's like you can't, it's not a credit program
Yeah.
for Augusta Tech. It's a non-credit program.
Yeah, and we'll take a further look into that because that's an interesting dynamic. With them being tied to Augusta Tech, maybe, but since they're providing the instructional training, my first mind would say yes. But before I give you a final answer, like I said, follow up with me and let's just look into it a little further. And I'll touch base with IMPEC just to make sure.
Jason, any of
Yes.
the non-credit courses that the technical college has, they are ITAs and they've been submitted to us. So I would assume that course would be the same way. It's an Augusta Tech course. It's just they've got a third party involved in the teaching, but it's still an Augusta Tech program. That's how like Manufacture Ready. That's how it's not a third party, but Manufacture Ready is an ITA that's operating through the Economic Development Division at the technical colleges. And they submit the program and it gets placed on goes through the application process, but it's still a technical college program.
Yeah, and like I said, I would say my first mind would be that it is, but and it's fine. And I don't imagine that it's not, but we definitely want to do just a little bit further research just to ensure and make sure it's no issue with IMPEC.
I figured I'd chime in because I'm from the Clubhouse, and so I'm part of this equation. So GenPEC reached out to us because of the boot camp and had us do the exemption forms related to that,
Okay.
and Augusta Tech signed off on those. So
Okay.
That's how the process worked.
Thank you for that insight. So, yeah, that answered the question.
So this clubhouse, if they signed off on the exemption form, that means that they are not necessarily, if they want to move away, I mean, I'm just saying, the other programs, or if this happens to another program, if they sign an exemption form through NPAC, then they do not have to be accredited to be on the ETPL themselves.
That is correct.
Okay.
Any exempt programs do not have to be accredited through NPAC. But NPAC does have an exemption form, and typically they keep a list that you can find on their website of all exempt providers and programs. Okay, then we have our program requirements. Again, another brief definition at the top. You can find it on a list, but the main thing, something I want to reiterate that I just pointed out with NPAC, and it may be somewhat of a recurring theme as far as the ETPL, is every program has to go through the application approval process for the ETPL. Not just the provider, every program. And again, like I said, also it's the same for NPAC. If there's someone that has to be approved or accredited by NPAC, every program needs to go through the NPAC process. So please, please remember that, and I'll remind you a few more times before I'm done in this presentation. But please remember that. Some of the base requirements, program description. One of the requirements that we have, your program description on the ETPL should be the same as your on the catalog for any training providers. Another goal of WIOA is for informed customer choice. That means that all WIOA participants should see what general students see when they look at a program on a catalog or a website. So we need to work together as a unit across the state. At the state office, myself and Norris can only do so many things, but if we can all kind of speak to this when we're talking to our training providers, not just having good program descriptions, but also up-to-date program descriptions. We still have some out-of-date program descriptions where it just says, get a bachelor or associate's in 2 years in nursing. And it's like, okay, what else is going on with the program? These type of things we have to work together to address. If you see it and you have an opportunity to speak to it, please do. We're doing everything we can at the state to address all these issues, but again, if we can all work collectively to make sure that we maximize and optimize the ETPL, this is a great way that we can do it. Also, you have your program costs, credentials that can be obtained, but the most critical of all of these would be your performance data. Stephen spoke to the performance data. I think everyone here is fairly familiar with the performance data. But it's also critical that on the ETPL we have this information available. This is another big piece in making sure that we all participants are informed and can make an informed decision that when I choose this program by this provider versus this one, I can see that the performance is better over here and it's going to put me in a better situation as far as obtaining a career. So that, again, these pieces are very critical. I'm not going to get into the weeds of them, but I do want to just, again, emphasize their importance and our importance as a state to make sure that we all kind of push this agenda. I later add our ETPL exceptions, on-the-job training, customized training, incumbent worker training. Of course, none of these pieces have to be on the ETPL. And we just want to point this out just to make sure, because sometimes it can be some confusion. It's not always easy to kind of determine what is what. But if it does fit into any of these categories, again, that doesn't require ETPL approval. That's just going to be handled at your local office or the contract and however you all set it up. Any questions?
I know we've got our star boss folks, but just folks who aren't really familiar with our system. Now a lot of times we have questions, and I think it comes from folks who are conflating training providers from service providers. And when we're talking about providers being on the eligible training provider list, now we still do want providers listed in the system so that we know who provided services to our participants, especially with OJTs and with that employer measure. We would like to know what employers these folks are being placed with for their OJT. So while the employer obviously doesn't have to go through the ETP process, we still would like them listed as the provider in the system for that OJT.
Okay, then there is the ETPL Initial Eligibility. I got a few points up here. Won't get, again, too deep into the weeds. Providers proposing new training programs have to complete the application for every program. Those last two words are very critical, per program. Yes, like I said, I'm going to emphasize that over and over, per program. Initial eligibility, once approved, ends in 1 year. Like the example, if a program is approved January 1st, it will expire its initial eligibility on December 31st of that year. Now, once initial eligibility is completed, if that program meets all or satisfies our criteria, performance, everything involved, then that program is granted continued eligibility or subsequent eligibility. We refer to it in a few different ways, and I'll get into that a little more in a moment. Initial eligibility, when applying for initial eligibility, a program must provide successful outcomes for at least 5 students. That's how we'll gauge and assess whether or not that program is going to be a good program for the ETPL. Now, there is a caveat to that, as I have listed on the second point. If this is an existing provider and they're creating a new program that is comparable to something that they already have, for example, let's say someone has a security IT program, CCNA or something like that, that they're adding, and they have another program that's comparable to that. What we will allow, if that provider is in good standing, the program is in good standing, that new program can dismiss the 5 student criteria and create a narrative towards the performance outcomes based on that comparable existing or approved program. So that's something to remember, because I know at times we have new industry standards, new programs that come up, and if it's, like I said, if it's a provider that's already in good standing, they have a similar program, then we don't need to wait on them to have 5 students. We can go ahead and move forward with that program as long as they have a comparable program that they can use to create a narrative for performance outcomes. As far as the application process, the applications are submitted to our local areas. The local areas, once they go through the review and evaluation and approve, they push it to us at the state. And then once we approve it at the state, it is accessible on the state ETPL. But something I want to also drive home is that our local areas do have the ability to restrict their program if it doesn't meet their criteria, meaning just because we approved it at the state and now it's accessible statewide, if that area and it doesn't meet their in-demand labor market needs, they can deny the use of that program in their area. Again, that autonomy is allowed with our local areas so that we can drive our performance outcomes and ensure that training is being provided for labor market demand. So that's something always good to remember. Any questions with initial eligibility? Oh, 1 second, sorry.
What if a college is trying to do a program that's done at another college? Can you use the narrative, the data from the other college to support?
Now, that's something we haven't actually considered in our policy. Typically, we want to use the same provider, but at the same time, I can understand when you're looking at a network, whether it's TCSG or USG, that's definitely something we probably want to consider. And I would say, tentatively, right now, yes, but if I'll give you one of my cards, and if you'll follow up with me, we'll come up with a definite answer on that. Right now, that concession is really just for the specific provider, but again, like I said, if it's the network, it makes sense that they can use that. So, great question, and it's something great for us to consider.
Which board initiates the process, the beginning process for eligibility? Is it the one that wants to service or where the provider is geographically located?
Well, by default, we definitely prefer to be where it's geographically located. Of course, if it doesn't meet demand in that area, that provider can reach out to another area to pursue the process. But initially, the preference is to go and use the office that's in the geographic. All right, so moving on to subsequent or biennial eligibility. Like I said, typically we refer to it as continued eligibility. I try to breeze through this. I know we're kind of getting close to time. All provider programs are subject to continued eligibility at least once a year, at least twice every 2 years, but that could happen every year. We're looking at a couple different ways to manage our continued eligibility process. We do have our annual performance reports, which is going to require that all approved programs submit information every year anyway. We may run our continued eligibility around that process. But for now, just know that with this continued eligibility, once initial eligibility is completed, if they satisfy our criteria, they then go to a 2-year review process as far as remaining on the ETPL list. We look at the performance measures, the same ones that Steve just mentioned. After 2 years, what we look for is 10 WIOA participants. If they haven't satisfied the 10 participant criteria, what we do is extend that eligibility period for another year to give them another year time to reach that 10 participant mark. Then if not, then that's something we have to revisit at the time of reapplication at the end of that period. But if they meet those 10 participants in the first 2 years, then we'll look at those performance criteria as a way to gauge whether or not they will remain on the continued eligibility list. And finally, again, it speaks to the 10 students. One thing that we also want to push real hard with our training providers is tracking your performance information, also as well as the student information. For our employee outcomes, we pull from the GDOL unemployment insurance system to verify employment outcomes. So we want those providers to keep this information so that when it's time to track it, and like Steve said, we're working on a way to track this information and pull it all in at one time with GEO. But once we get that worked out, we will need our providers to have, whether it's a social security number or some type of participant identifier so that we can pull information. And then finally, the state reserves the right to request additional information, whether it's dropout rates or anything like that. If we feel like we don't have sufficient information to gauge whether or not a provider or a program is up to par, we may pull additional information just to take a further look and see, okay, is this program worth keeping on the list, or is this one that we should remove?
So a couple of things I want to hammer home. I know we got our STAR folks in the back who know more than I do probably. But for everybody else, just to make sure that, because I get these questions regularly, I just want to make sure that we're perfectly clear. So for customized training and OJT, you don't have to worry about credentials. All right. So a lot of folks were concerned. I've heard concerns quite often about credentials for customized training and OJT. You don't have to worry about that. For registered apprenticeships, that completion certificate, when they complete that registered apprenticeship, is a recognized credential. I've heard some local areas are concerned about putting people through apprenticeships because of the credential. As long as it's a registered apprenticeship from U.S. Department of Labor and they complete that apprenticeship, they'll get a certificate of completion, and that credential counts. Performance for incumbent worker training does not count against local areas. I want to hammer that home. And also, I was thinking about the question, you don't really need to go through an orientation for that IWT. As long as you're not looking to co-enroll these individuals with regular formula funds, you don't have to worry about the orientation being tagged to formula funds. So you don't have to worry about that. And then last, I already brought that up, was you don't have to worry about going through the ETPL process for customized training, incumbent worker training, and OJTs. But we do want the providers listed.